Hey there, this is Kelly Finkowski, and today we're shining the spotlight on getting our backyard ready for the spring gardening season. Today with me is Grace Kunkel, who is an extension agent with the Virginia Cooperative. Grace, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, it's beautiful outside right now, and you have some background. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your experience with the Virginia Co-op?
Absolutely. So, Virginia Cooperative Extension, it's extension services are a way for the land grant universities. So, for us, it's Virginia Tech and Virginia State University to extend the science-backed resources produced at the university out into the community. Primarily working with agricultural producers and farmers, but also homeowners on all kinds of things like how to care for their landscape, how to identify a certain insect or deal with a pest issue or select plants to go in their garden. Um, and my personal background prior to coming, so I've been with Extension for almost 2 years now. And prior to joining Extension, my background was more focused on honeybee health and pollinator health. I studied entomology, which is the biology of insects at the University of Maryland. And I just love talking with people about bugs and helping them see how insect diversity is a really good thing for our local environment.
Well, let's jump into that then, because I know a lot of people right now with cleaning up their yards after a long winter and fall. There's a lot of people who go out and they take all their leaves and they blow them off to the side, or they bag them, or they chip them. But those leaves that are laying on the ground can be a really important shelter for some of our insects. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. So a lot of insects lay eggs on the undersides of leaves, so you might not ever really notice them, but they're still there. Or buried underneath the leaves could be butterfly cocoons and things like that. We also have a lot of insects that are decomposers in our environment, and that will feed on that leaf material as it breaks down. It's also good to leave the leaves in terms of that adds nutrition and organic matter back into your soil,
Hmm.
which is something that if we don't take steps to kind of protect our soil, we can start to lose it over time due to erosion and things like that. So anymore, when people are thinking about getting out in their garden, like last fall, people want to put their gardens to bed for the winter and clean everything up, or in the spring, do a big spring clean.
Yeah.
Um, but you don't have to make your yard perfectly pristine. You don't need to bag up all of those leaves. You don't have to cut down all of the plant stems and things like that. And in fact, leaving some of that material provides food and habitat for the local wildlife and especially
Mhm.
the local insect population.
Absolutely. And I think what you're saying also, some of the seed that can be left behind, the birds can feed on that. And then you don't have to deal with bird feeders as much if you've got natural sources for them. So if I do have
Absolutely.
a lot of leaves, would it be better off for the pollinators and the insects if I just blew them off to a side of my yard where they don't bother me, not necessarily chopping them up or throwing them out in the trash?
Yeah, and I understand people have to balance, what they're willing to tolerate in terms of having leaves around in their yard. Maybe they don't want a big pile or they're concerned about, the plants underneath, if they'll be okay underneath those leaves. I would say the best thing to do, if you're able to just leave them, or you can kind of pile them up in an area where you don't mind the leaves being. The worst thing would be to bag them up and remove them from the yard completely, because nothing's really going to be able to survive that process. Whereas moving them, lightly mulching them, getting them into a certain area, all those things still leave enough of the leaves in place, and it still gives a lot of the insects a chance. Whereas putting them in a plastic bag or something like that and putting it out to the curb, that's completely removing all of those insect eggs and things from your environment.
And another thing you said also is the idea that people don't need to be focused on having a perfect lawn. And that is a huge, I know, I consider it a very successful marketing campaign, the idea that we all need perfectly green, pristine front yards and backyards. But that's very high maintenance. You're talking about trying to control weeds, you're talking about mowing it on a regular basis. People do a lot of treatment for their lawn. What would a more sustainable yard look like if you want to take away all these things that we're doing to it and just take the pressure back to something more natural? What should people consider?
These are great questions, and I get questions related to this all the time. And working with people on their lawns is something that we do a lot of because as extension agents, we're ultimately always thinking about how to protect the Chesapeake Bay and our watersheds. And when people are over applying things like fertilizers to their lawn, that all ultimately ends up in our waterways. So there's a number of things people can do. And, I'm not here to judge if somebody does want a perfectly tidy lawn, but maybe to just take some of that pressure off. So,
Mhm.
for instance, in early spring, maybe mowing slightly less to allow some of those things that might typically be considered weeds to actually grow up a little bit and bloom and support the local wildlife that way. For example, clover, Dutch white clover, that used to be in the bag of seed mix along with the grass seed. And then the trend became to get that clover out of there so that there'd be a perfectly green, uniform lawn. But that clover has a job to do. A, it supports pollinators. They love clover. But B, clover is a legume and that legumes actually add nitrogen, so essentially are fertilizing our soil. And so having some of that clover present in your lawn will keep it healthier over time. And then the caretaker of that lawn would have to do less to keep their lawn looking nice.
True. And I know clover, I know in my yard at least, I think clover and I want to say like little violet and maybe some sort of a red nettle. Those are the
Mhm.
first things that I see bees flocking to. As soon as those start to come up, you'll start seeing more bees, and then you'll see some bunny rabbits hopping by. So again, we personally don't mow that first crop because we know it's so important to our wildlife. And clover
Yeah.
also is so much more tolerant of like the dogs running around on it, the kids running around on it. It can hang out really well.
Yeah, it's very durable. And so if you're willing to tolerate, having some of those blooming, weeds in there, it
Mhm.
can actually be a good thing, in terms of support, sustainable landscaping. It is quite a bit of effort to maintain a perfectly manicured lawn. And then especially in Virginia, we live in kind of a transition area where we don't have one really great variety of grass. We have people who either have cool season or warm season, and so
Right.
our lawns are never looking perfect year round anyway. And so a big part of what I do is also just talk with people about that and help them understand the conditions that we're living in so that we're not constantly fighting against them, but just accepting and
Mhm.
having some tolerance um, of what things are going to look like.
And so, with that sort of more natural approach, too, when we talk about our pollinators and other friendly bugs, what else can we do to help support those healthier populations?
That's a great question. So any blooming plants are a good starting point for supporting pollinators. If people can only do one thing to support pollinators, choose a blooming tree or shrub to incorporate into your landscape. For instance, Eastern redbud is a beautiful small tree that's native to the area and it blooms in very early spring. It has gorgeous little pink flowers. And that supports pollinators. And when you plant a blooming tree or shrub, that's a lot of flowers in a very small area. So you get a lot of impact and bang for your buck, without having to invest in all new landscaping, for
Right.
instance, or something like that. People can fairly easily work annual flowers into their local environment. Like planting sunflowers is an awesome thing to do, and it just makes people happy. And then when we're talking about specifically our native pollinators and our native bees, getting curious about native plants and what native plants are available and might work for your landscape, those are really good options for supporting native pollinators.
And that focus on native plant choices. I know we see a lot of the, I mean, said Bradford pear or the Calorie pears. Those spread like crazy. We have the tree of heaven that has spread crazy, mimosa trees. I've had one mimosa tree keep popping up in the same location every single year. How do we know that we're purchasing or planting something that is native and less likely to run off and start a whole new tree colony?
Yeah, these are great questions. And the Bradford pear, Calorie pear, that's blooming right now. You can see it everywhere. It's those white flowers. And
Mhm.
escaped is a great word for it. You know, those were heavily planted 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. Um, and have since escaped. And so when people are curious about things like native plants, or at a minimum, things that won't escape, but usually, and especially these days, nurseries are doing a much better job of labeling native plants because they know that people are looking specifically for that. There are also nurseries that specialize more in native plants than other ones, and also local garden clubs will ha often have things like native plant sales. So they're trying to increase the access of those plants for people, so they're easier to find.
So you just have to check the labels and maybe do a little bit of research into what you're buying before you pick it.
Yeah.
So is there anything that people tend to rush for to start doing right away in the spring? They get excited about warm weather and oops, what do we do? There's something that people should hold off on and take a little bit more time.
Um, I think so. You don't have to rush to clean everything up. As we get more warmer days under our belt, a lot of the insects that have overwintered will start to emerge, and then you can feel a little bit better about, tidying up those stems or leaf piles. I would say the one thing that I notice people doing is they'll get really excited and they'll take on a big project. But where you really want to start is learning the most you can about your conditions. So, conducting a soil test on your lawn if you've never done that, so that you can understand what your soil conditions are and what you do or don't need to add to support plants. And before you buy plants, having some understanding of your local conditions so that what you purchase is actually a good fit for you for the conditions that you have. I'd say that people get discouraged because they go out, they buy a bunch of plants, or they want to rehab a whole area. But if they haven't done some of that groundwork, they might be disappointed later on when some of their selections don't survive.
And a soil test is fairly simple, right? If I'm not mistaken, I think the Wowzer building in Stafford used to have some out there. Tell me about
We
those.
still do, and that's where my office is. So I'm the Stafford County Extension agent, and our office is located in the Rouser building off the Richmond Highway. And we have soil kits on the outside of the building available all the time. We also have them in the office. People can pick up the kits for free and take them home. They'll sample their soil. You might only need one kit to do your whole yard. It depends on how big of a space you have, as well
Mhm.
as if there are distinctly different areas or if it's all more or less uniform and similar. And it's my job to talk with people about that, and to help talk them through that and get through that process. So they'll sample their soil, and then when they'll send it in a small box to Virginia Tech with $10. And once the soil arrives at Virginia Tech, it usually only takes like 3 days to get the results. I also get a copy of the results so I can look them up and we can walk through them together. But what you get from that $10 is your pH, which is really important for some kinds of plants and also turf management, lawn management. But then also if you're missing any of the major nutrients in the soil as well.
So then you can amend your soil or make sure so you're not planting hydrangeas in the wrong pH,
Exactly.
that sort of thing.
Yep. Yep.
So, you mentioned your background as an entomology. Is there a bug that is just super misunderstood? People are like, ew, getting away from my garden, and it's actually something we should be encouraging.
Well, everything is nuanced, right? And so mosquitoes are a great example. Mosquitoes drive people crazy, and we had a really wet, even though we were in a drought, we also had a lot of wet periods this last summer. And I was getting a lot of calls about mosquitoes, and but there are fairly simple things we can do to reduce how mosquitoes are coming into contact with us. For instance, they're terrible flyers, so if you have a fan, they won't be able to reach you. And so that might be a better, more sustainable option, for example, than like spraying a pesticide that is broad spectrum and impacts all kinds of different insects in your yard. Because if you do something like that, you might also be killing some of the natural predators that eat the mosquitoes.
Hmm.
Mosquitoes are also a major food source for a lot of wildlife. So bats eat them, other insects eat them. So we don't want to say they're all evil, even though they annoy us and they can be a public health concern. They definitely still have a role in the environment. I also, in the news sometimes, and also sometimes in my conversations with different interest groups, I think that people can sometimes pit like native bees against honeybees, which aren't
I have heard
technically
that
native.
too.
Yeah, and so that's an interesting conversation I like to have. I worked on honeybees for a long time, and I still work with a lot of beekeepers, and I work with native bee enthusiasts, and I encourage insect biodiversity. And I think what I want people to understand is honeybees have been here a long time, and we rely on them very much for agriculture and how we produce food in this
Mhm.
country. They're essentially livestock, and they have a very important role. Our native pollinators, so honeybees are also struggling. They have health issues, and beekeepers are struggling to keep their bees healthy. It's become tremendously expensive to do so, but we need them to pollinate our crops. Our native bees are also struggling. We know that we're losing diversity, and we need to do a better job of supporting them and encouraging people to reduce pesticide use and things like that because our native bees are very sensitive to those things. And I just don't feel it's productive to kind of pit them against each other, because we need both and we very much rely on both. And so looking for ways that we can support both and encourage biodiversity, I think is a more productive conversation.
That's actually one of my favorite thing to look for every, like towards the end of the summer, we have a few asters and the number of different bees that will visit the same plant. There's so many. I think Virginia has over 100 different bee species, don't we? We have a lot.
We have quite a bit, and I'm just trying
And
to
they're
learn more
so cool to find them. It's so neat to see the
myself.
different sizes, the different colorings and everything. And I want to touch on something you said too about the idea of the people who treat their yards for mosquitoes. And you say, it's a broad spectrum product. And I have had salespeople come up and say, oh, well, it's just going to get the mosquitoes and the bad bugs. And I said, how do you know that it's not getting the good one? And they can't answer that question because I think whatever it is you're spraying, it's not specific to just mosquitoes. It's going to get
Yeah.
anything. And like you said, the other animals that rely on those insects for their food can become ill as well. I think with anything you spray, you have a risk of, making rabbits sick, making the owls sick. You can really have a very long, wide range of impacts just from one spray.
Yeah, anytime we're going to introduce a chemical into the environment, you have to consider those unintended consequences. And that is part of my job as well, is to actually work with those salespeople and the pesticide applicators and talk through these issues and encourage if a more selective option is available, for instance, is a better choice than something that's considered broad spectrum. And then for those, who might have a neighbor who's having their yard sprayed, or, I mean, certainly at times, mosquitoes can be a public health concern. Ticks can be a public health
Right.
concern because they can also carry disease. So we have to keep that in mind as well. But maybe engaging your neighbor and asking why they want to have the spray done. Like, are they very concerned about mosquitoes? Do they have a really bad reaction when they get bit? Trying to understand why they want to reduce the mosquito population, and then maybe sharing some options with them or encouraging them to talk with someone like me or reach out to their local extension office to see if maybe there's other options beyond, spraying the whole yard or something like that.
And then you did mention tick. What's the management solution for tick? Because I have two dogs and we've already found one this year.
Oh yeah, any day that is like a warm day, even if it's in the middle of winter, you can get a
Awful.
tick. So for ticks, some of the better, I think, especially those of us who have dogs, you do want to try to reduce some of the brushy areas. Like super tall grass can be an environment that ticks like to be in,
Mhm.
especially if that then encourages rabbits or if you have a lot of deer around as well. So maybe thinking about where you're going to have those areas versus where is a high traffic area for you and your family and trying to keep that area a little bit more clear. Um, Personal protective clothing. So, wearing long pants that you can tuck your pants into your socks so that there's no gap for those ticks to walk up the inside of your pants.
Mhm.
Taking a shower after being outdoors. Kind of some basic common sense stuff like that, but also reducing the habitats that they like to be in.
I feel like ticks are one of those, it's kind of like cockroaches. They're just, you can't escape them. Well, let's
Yeah.
do, I'm gonna ask one more question just for fun. Do you have a favorite bug?
Oh my gosh, I love all bugs. I really love working with beekeepers and honeybees. I think that is such a fascinating system of how we produce food in this country. Gosh, I don't know if I could just pick one bug though. That's a really tough one.
No pressure. I was just curious. I think there's always some people have very interesting ones to go down a wormhole with. But Grace, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to jump into the spotlight with me and help talk about sustainable landscaping, backyard habitats, and our native pollinators. I appreciate your time today. And for anybody who's following along, if you've got questions that you want to have answered in the spotlight, send me a message. Thank you so much and have a great day.